Hi everyone. We're starting the chapter on research, everyone's favorite chapter in social psychology. So this is the only research chapter we're having, and then we get into all the interesting psychology stuff you're interested in. But it's really important to understand where all of this stuff comes from. And so we are going to dive into this. This is the chapter for it, and I'm going to cover it in 5 lectures. And the first is just asking, why do we need to understand research methods? And we'll get at that today, and we'll talk about descriptive research in this lecture. And then number 3, correlational research, will be a separate lecture. And I consider this one to be pretty important. So try and pay really close, especially close attention to that one. And then we'll talk about experimental research, which is used a lot in social psychology. And then in the last lecture, about 10 minutes long, we'll talk about challenges in social psych research. So why do we need to know research methods? All right, let's keep it really simple here. You don't want to get fooled. How are you going to know whether what this guy is telling you is true or not if you don't know enough about research to understand where he got his information? And we have things like this all the time, health products, or we're so often trying to sell things. And if you understand research, you have a better way of knowing whether it's a sound thing to buy or not, a good decision to make. And you might want to give yourself the best chance of meeting your goals. And by this I mean, eventually many of you are going to be counselors. And how are you going to know what techniques to use with someone you want to help? And a good way to know what techniques to use is to know about research, because you can not only look at research and understand it enough to know if evidence suggests this will work for your individual, but you can also conduct research if you have a new idea. And so that's the second reason. And the third reason is to keep yourself safe. I mean, people who you're getting this kind of information possibly, or some people are, and to not get the vaccine can be really a death sentence if you get COVID instead. And so it's really good if you know how to filter out good information and good research from what is not good and what's really going to mislead you and throw you off course. So those are 3 reasons for knowing research, kind of 4 combined into 3. So you can make decisions. I have a little bit of an example here. Even as long as we've been around, there have been decisions that were bad, but child rearing advice in the 1920s used to be, these are quotes from parents' guides that say, never hug or kiss your children, never let them sit on your lap. If you must, kiss them on the head when they say goodbye. Shake hands with them in the morning. Give them a pat on the head if they've made a really good job of a difficult task. This is 1928, and the people pictured are the President Franklin Delano Roosevelt and his wife Eleanor Roosevelt. And this is their children, and this is the advice they followed. And so we know that we want to be able to know whether this kind of advice is based on any kind of evidence, or if it's just off someone's head, someone's whim. And in this case, this was poor advice. We know how important touch is. It causes the release of oxytocin, which is a hormone in our bodies that promotes trust and attachment. It reduces our stress hormones. Children have cognitive and physical gains. And without it, infants struggle. They don't even grow physically. It's called failure to thrive. They may become insecure, anxious, neurotic, or even demonstrate autistic-like behaviors. And this was Harlow's work with primates. They'll recover from illness more slowly, and they'll have reduced gains if they're born prematurely. In fact, Montague in 1971 postulates that parenting, relying heavily on such impersonal child-rearing aids as infant carriers, bottles, pacifiers, strollers, swings, playpens, and cribs, which limit the child's experience of human soothing touch, produces individuals who are liable to lead lonely, isolated lives with its materialistic values and its addiction to things. And so we know that there was some bad advice, and that bad advice was heeded a bit too often, maybe to the extent that it even impacted generations to come. So how can we know if we're getting good advice? Well, we'll talk about a couple kinds of research. Basic research has no direct application to anything in everyday life yet. It's research that someone might say, why are you studying that? And an example, and I wrote the name ISENC down here, but the name is actually Ekman that I should have written, studied microexpressions. He spent a lot of his career doing this. He was interested in emotion and expression of emotion, and so he was looking at just the tiny little features of authentic and inauthentic facial expressions. And someone might think that this is kind of meaningless. But it might be that someone else, so this is basic research. It doesn't have any function. It might seem useless. But basic research leads to applied research. So Ekman's work would lead other researchers to apply basic knowledge in some current real-life situation. For example, we might apply Ekman's microexpression work to detect whether someone is being truthful, and that might benefit all kinds of things. You know, there's a possibility it could benefit relationships or harm relationships. It could benefit criminal proceedings. There are a lot of possible uses for this work, and so this application of his work is the applied research. So if you're asked a question on your quiz that says, is this basic research or applied research? Think about whether it has an immediate application to a real-life situation. Is it solving a problem for us right now? Or is it just interesting and curious, but nothing more? So we're going to talk about the three types of studies I already mentioned. Descriptive studies answer a question of what is happening. And they would either present answers in quantitative, which is numeric data like charts or graphs, or qualitative findings, which is like written out information, more like a narrative. The second way is a correlational study, and in this case we're answering questions about whether and how strongly things are related to each other, or whether an increase in one factor might predict an increase in another factor. And in experimental studies, we answer questions about why things happen or whether one factor might cause another factor. So what are some descriptive methods? Well, what we're going to talk about here are first off their purpose, which is just to describe the world around us, and we include case studies and observation and surveys and archival research. We also will talk, as was already mentioned, about qualitative information, which is like narrative document, and quantitative, which is numbers, like mean, median, mode, and standard deviation. So the first method we'll discuss is called a case study. And a case study is in-depth examination of one or a few subjects who share a common characteristic. It could be maybe 1 to 5 individuals will all be part of a case study, or 1 to 5 organizations. Like for individuals, let's say you wanted to study children who were geniuses and who grew up just absolutely brilliant, finishing college when they're 12, that sort of thing. And so then you might just choose 1 to 5 and focus on them. And you might choose 1 to 5 organizations, like let's say schools that have turned around and made really a big success, even though they're working with kids who maybe have a lot of challenges. And I gave another example here. You're interested in studying individuals who live to a very old age and seem very happy in all their lives. What were the parts of their lives? Is there anything we can detect in their lives that might have, offered this happiness in old age? And so what kind of data are we gathering? Well, remember, data is just information. And it could include interview data. We might interview them. We might interview their families and teachers. We might take a look at their school records or their medical records. Maybe there's something in their schooling or health that we could detect. We might look at email messages or letters or other kinds of correspondence. Nowadays, we would probably include like posts that they made on Facebook, things like that. We might go into their home and observe what's there, what's in the home, what's out the window, how much light is in the home. We might look at old journals, writings, art, things like that. And all these things of us gaining a lens into these one or a few cases. The problem, of course, with gathering data this way is that it's not generalizable. That is, whatever we learn about this person, we can't infer that other people who have some of these conditions will share the same outcome of old age and happiness. That's what we mean by generalizability. We couldn't do this case study and say, in general then, people who blank, blank, blank are going to have greater happiness. So we couldn't draw those kinds of conclusions. Here are some examples of case studies. These are all books, actually. Very often case studies emerge this way. This was Promises I Could Keep, and they chose women who had their babies young and out of marriage. They were interested in why did they choose to have children? Another one is unequal childhoods, and in this one, the researchers' students went and would stay in the homes of families to actually gain a sense of what is home life like for these children. And after a while, the families got used to them, and they learned quite a lot about what's different in childhoods of different social classes. And another social class thing was savage inequalities, and in this case, Jonathan Kozol was studying schools. And he went, for example, to Chicago, and he went to a very, very rich school and spent a lot of time there. And then he went just a mile away from the rich school to a very, very poor school and spent a lot of time there and looked at what was happening in those schools. Method 2 is observation, and this would be observing subjects in a natural or lab setting to learn about their behaviors and attitudes. And we'll talk about 3 types of observation. In naturalistic observation, a researcher is going into a natural setting where the children are, like, for example, the playground at recess. And he's not, or she isn't interacting, just observing what's happening. In laboratory observation, there's a sort of a set stage, and people are invited into it, and then they're observed sort of through a two-way mirror, so they don't necessarily know they're being observed until later. And Ainsworth's strange situation is like that, and that's a task in which they try to understand how, through a series of exchanges, how attached very young children are to their parents. And participatory observation is when the observer is participating in the activity at the same time as making the observation, like a teacher who observes and documents the habits of outbursts in a child. So she might be trying to figure out the best way to help the child, and so while she's teaching, she's documenting, this happened, and then the child had an outburst. The problems are, the incidence of interest might not occur that often. Like, you might be interested in how people handle natural disasters, but natural disasters thankfully don't occur that often. Secondly, we can't determine causation. That is to say, we can't determine what caused what or why something happened, only that it happened. And then we do have the observer effect, or the Hawthorne effect. The Hawthorne effect is telling us that observation changes behaviors. So the example was that some researchers were interested in lighting in a workplace, and so they changed the lighting for some people and didn't change it for others. And they found that irrespective of the light, the workers' performance improved. And it wasn't because of the light, but because of the observers. The third method is surveys, and surveys are self-report. You've all filled them out. They can be formal and informal. So informal surveys may be a newspaper, a magazine is taking a guess and giving you questions to answer. And formal, called inventories, are psychologist tests, like to measure your personality or something like that. A problem with a basic survey to get information in a descriptive way, one problem is called non-response bias. And it means that those who respond are somehow different from those who don't respond. An example is this. Imagine yourself in a restaurant, and in the center of the table there are some cards that say, comment cards, please give us your feedback. And I wonder if any of you have ever filled one of those out. And so probably you've seen them and not filled them out, but if you ever did fill one out, I'll bet it's because you either had a really, really good experience or a really, really bad experience. And so that means that your experience when you filled out the card, when you responded, was really different from your experience and the experience of others who do not respond. That's called non-response bias, and it means that those who respond are different. Desire to please the researcher is another phenomenon that can affect survey results. Some situations might prompt individuals to try and guess what the researcher wants to hear and say it. And honesty might be a problem because some topics might be embarrassing or troubling, like if you're asked about sexual habits or digestive habits, or maybe, say, illegal things, and so then maybe you wouldn't be honest. Finally, sampling might not be representative of the population. If you've heard of a term, random sampling, that's the term that would be so important here, and that means that you've chosen every single individual in your population of interest has an equal chance of being chosen. And it's hard to get that, actually, and most of the time surveys use what's called convenience samples, like someone who has a Facebook account might post the survey on there and then they would get their friends, but they wouldn't get a random sample of the population. That's why the census chooses who they're going to survey and works so hard to get their information. Some survey data can often be presented quantitatively, that means in numbers, and so you might see charts like this. This is just descriptive data telling us whatever question they asked, what percentage of people did whatever the thing was, never or once per year, several times a year, and so forth. And then it might be presented in a graph like this, or a histogram, depending on the data type. And then we also see, I'm just giving you these terms and not going into detail, but different ways of describing data, like presenting the mean, the median, the mode, and the range. And those are just so you're remembering those as descriptive pieces of information, describing the data set. Method 4 is archival research, and archives are just storage areas for old documents and old records. Something like this, like looking at people and what they had in their possession when they came over to this country, or someone's prison record. So an archive is a collection of historic records about a person or group of people. What archival researchers do is they review these records to determine history, patterns, anomalies, trends, and so forth. And sociologists might do this quite a lot. Maybe it would include institutional records or hospital records or school records, etc. An example of archival research was a study that showed this. They were trying to find out the race of people who are in prison, and by gathering these archival records and analyzing them, they discovered that non-white people had much increasing rates of being incarcerated relative to white people. And that's really important to know, and it's in particular for drug offenses. And we don't posit that non-white people abuse more drugs than white people. We posit that they're prosecuted differently. So this became a very important finding for what was going on. Another example is COVID-19. We might ask, could archived medical records help us understand the trajectory of a deadly disease? So if we could look at people's records before COVID-19 was officially identified, would we find more evidence of it and we could understand it better? So this is the end of the descriptive chapter. So in summary, we need to know research in order to make good decisions, filter out those who would mislead us, and offer best treatments. Basic research examines phenomena with no known application, but applied research takes that knowledge and uses it to improve some real-life condition. Descriptive research, what we talked about today, can be quantitative or qualitative. Qualitative research describes phenomena through case studies, observations, surveys, or archival records analysis, and these are just a few methods. There are many more. And quantitative research describes phenomena in numbers, like mean, median, mode, and standard deviation. But it doesn't have experimental methods, so even though it's using numbers, it's still descriptive. It's just describing what is happening. Thanks for tuning in here.